Okay, let's dig into this. We've just seen a really intense period in the war in Ukraine, haven't we?
Definitely. A real back and forth.
Yeah, Russia hitting Ukraine with what, over 400 missiles and drones in just a short window. And then Ukraine pulls off this, well, it's been called a spectacular assault on several Russian air bases.
Taking out, or at least damaging, an unknown number of those strategic bombers. The Tu-95s, the Tu-22s, the ones they use for the big missile launches.
Right. It really feels like something's shifted, like we've entered a new, maybe more dangerous phase.
It certainly feels like a change in tempo, maybe even, strategic adjustment on both sides.
Exactly. So to help us and you get a handle on what this all means, we've pulled together some really solid sources for this deep dive.
We've got analysis from the Lowy Institute, which is always sharp.
Yep. And a very detailed research brief from the RAND Corporation, focusing specifically on that tricky issue of escalation risks.
Which is crucial right now.
It really is. And we've also looked at some online discussions, more personal takes that show the human side of all this.
Yeah, bringing those different perspectives together, the strategic view and the on-the-ground reality, that's key.
Right. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of the noise. What do these strikes actually tell us, not just militarily, but about where the war might be heading and that constant lurking danger of escalation?
Trying to give you a clearer picture of what really matters in all this complexity.
Okay, so let's start with Ukraine's perspective. Why these long-range strikes, hitting air bases, hitting targets sometimes deep inside Russia? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, the Lowy source breaks down a few main goals. First off, it's about degrading Russia's actual ability to fight.
Chipping away at their war machine.
Exactly. Hitting factories, oil refineries, the stuff Russia needs to sustain the invasion. It's not just symbolic. It's trying to physically reduce their capacity.
Makes sense. And Lowy mentions another point about demonstrating capability.
Yeah, that's huge. Especially when Ukraine is taking hits night after night from hundreds of Russian drones. They need to show their international backers, and frankly their own population, that they aren't just absorbing blows.
That they can punch back. That Russian victory isn't, a done deal.
Precisely. That demonstration factor feels really critical right now. And the third aim Lowy points to is political pressure.
Trying to make Putin feel the heat? Maybe push towards some kind of negotiation?
Potentially. Creating conditions, or trying to, that might lead to a more favorable end to the war for Ukraine. It's a long shot, maybe, but it's part of the strategy.
Okay, so focusing on those specific airbase strikes recently, what were the immediate impacts, according to Lowy?
Well, one big one is forcing Russia to rethink where it keeps its strategic bombers. These are high-value assets.
The planes launching those hard-to-stop missiles.
Right. If bases near Ukraine, or even further back, are now vulnerable, Russia might have to pull them back even further, or maybe constantly move them around.
Which sounds like a logistical nightmare for them.
Yeah. It is. And it could also force them to divert precious air defense systems. Systems they might need elsewhere, like protecting cities or troops on the front line, now maybe needed just to guard air bases.
Creating tough choices for Russian commanders.
Exactly. That's a significant trade-off. And of course, the most direct impact is potentially reducing the number of bombers actually available to launch those long-range missiles.
And Lowy stresses why those missiles matter so much, right?
Yes, because compared to the cheaper drones Russia is using in huge numbers, these air-launched cruise missiles are generally much harder to intercept. They're more accurate, bigger warheads. They just have a better chance of getting through.
So taking out the planes that carry them is a major blow to Russia's most effective strike capability.
It really is. It's a key way for Ukraine to try and lessen the impact of the most damaging attacks they face.
Beyond the military side, there's a huge morale aspect here too, isn't there? For both sides, probably.
Absolutely. Lowy talks about the need for these counterpunches. Psychologically, when you're under constant bombardment, seeing your own side hit back effectively at high-profile targets, that's vital.
A boost for civilians, for soldiers.
Definitely. And Lowy described these recent airbase attacks as maybe the most spectacular Ukrainian long-range strikes in quite some time. You can imagine the effect that has.
And you really see the flip side of that, the human cost, in those online discussions we looked at. That Reddit source mentioning the death of a U.S. Marine volunteer. Mayhem.
Yeah, killed in one of those Russian drone strikes.
Yeah.
And the outpouring, calling him a hero, a defender of freedom. It just grounds this whole strategic discussion in the the brutal reality people are living and dying through.
It really does. It underscores the human stakes behind the strategy, the grief that fuels the determination to fight back.
It's palpable when you read those comments.
Okay, so these Ukrainian strikes are significant tactically and morally. But the Lowy analysis injects some realism too, right? Urging us to temper our expectations.
Yes. They make the point that while these attacks are, spectacular and impactful, they're unlikely on their own to fundamentally change Putin's core objectives, his maximalist goals, as Lowy calls them.
Meaning he still wants total victory, essentially.
That seems to be the assessment. He's faced setbacks and attacks inside Russia before, and his basic war aims haven't really budged. These are tactical wins for Ukraine, but the overall strategic grind continues.
And that leads us straight into the wider and, frankly, more worrying context of escalation. This is where the RAND Corporation brief really comes in.
Yeah, RAND digs deep into this. And one striking thing they note is that despite all the horrific violence, certain really major escalatory steps haven't happened yet.
Thankfully. Like Russia directly attacking a NATO country.
Or using nuclear weapons inside Ukraine. Those are lines that, so far at least, haven't been crossed.
So why not? RAND explores Putin's restraint. What are their thoughts?
Well, fear of NATO's military power is a big one. A direct clash with the entire alliance is something Russia clearly wants to avoid.
Okay, that makes sense. But RAND also mentions something about the information Putin might be getting.
Right. This is interesting. They suggest the information reaching Putin might be, let's say, filtered, perhaps overly optimistic. He might genuinely believe Russia can still win a long, drawn-out war.
And if he believes that,
then the perceived need to take massive risks, like nuclear escalation, might seem less urgent to him. It's a counterintuitive idea.
Yeah.
Bad information potentially preventing the worst outcome.
Wow. Yeah.
And RAND also points to the way NATO aid has arrived incrementally. Not all at once, in some huge surge.
So no single moment that felt like a massive sudden shift, forcing an extreme Russian reaction.
That's the idea. It's been more gradual, allowing Russia to adjust, perhaps, without feeling cornered into an immediate drastic response.
RAND also talks about misperceptions on both sides going into this whole thing. What did they get wrong?
Well, Putin clearly overestimated his own military, underestimated Ukraine's will to fight, and definitely underestimated the West's unity and resolve. He didn't see NATO getting stronger because of this.
And the West. What were our miscalculations, according to RAND?
RAND suggests the West might have underestimated just how deep Russia's fear of NATO actually runs. That fear is a key driver of their caution about direct conflict. And maybe we overestimated some of Russia's non-military tools, like using energy supplies as a weapon. It hurt, but it didn't cripple Europe the way some feared.
Okay, so let's connect these pieces. We have Ukraine striking inside Russia, these air bases, for example. And we have RAND's analysis of escalation. They identify a specific risk pathway, right?
Yes, the key point in the RAND brief is that more destructive Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians could trigger an escalatory spiral if Ukraine feels it has to respond with even more intense attacks inside Russia itself.
And we've just seen Ukraine demonstrate they can hit inside Russia.
Exactly. RAND confirms Ukraine has the motivation aligning with those goals Lowy mentioned, like degrading capacity and pressuring Putin, and they have the capability, especially with drones, UAS, to expand those strikes.
What kind of targets inside Russia might they go for, according to RAND?
Things like military logistics hubs, command centers, trying to disrupt the Russian military directly, or maybe hitting infrastructure to raise the domestic political cost for Putin and the leadership, making the war felt more acutely back home in Russia.
And we see echoes of that in those online discussions too, don't we? People talking about hits on airfields, the Crimean Bridge.
Yeah, and even speculating about the impact on Russian morale. Someone mentioned seeing a depressed Russian delegation after the airbase strikes. Whether that's accurate or not, it shows these strikes inside Russia are definitely part of the narrative, part of the psychological war.
It's information warfare happening in real time alongside the kinetic stuff. But RAND does mention some potential breaks on Ukraine striking too deep or too often.
Sure. The big one is just operational limits. Their forces are stretched thin already fighting on the front lines. And then there's the issue of promises made about using Western-supplied weapons.
Restrictions on targeting Russian territory with those weapons.
Right. But RAND adds a really important caveat here. If Ukraine felt it was facing existential threat, like imminent defeat, they might feel compelled to ignore those restrictions. Survival could trump previous agreements or external pressures.
So that risk of a spiral of things escalating back and forth, it's still very much there. And RAND also warns about inadvertent escalation, right? accidents, misunderstandings.
Yes, this is a huge area of concern. They give examples like, say, an accidental Russian strike hitting NATO officials visiting Kyiv. Even if unintended, how would NATO react?
Or a close call between military planes, like a Russian jet buzzing a U.S. drone over the Black Sea, but this time it leads to a crash and casualties.
Exactly. That could trigger a response cycle very quickly, even if neither side initially intended to attack the other.
And misreading signals?
That's another big one, Rand highlights. Russia seeing NATO military exercises, or even just political talk about Ukraine joining NATO someday and misinterpreting it as preparation for intervention.
Leading them to lash out preemptively, thinking they're defending themselves.
It's a minefield of potential miscalculations.
Truly terrifying possibilities. Beyond accidents, Rand also talks about deliberate escalation by Russia. When might that become more likely?
The risk goes up significantly, Rand warns. If Russia faces a sudden, catastrophic collapse on the battlefield, or if Putin feels his own grip on power internally is seriously threatened.
In that kind of desperate situation.
Rand suggests that even the unthinkable, like using nuclear weapons inside Ukraine, might start to look like the best among a set of bad options, from Putin's perspective, despite all the global risks.
And Rand notes there's no guarantee they'd limit it to just one tactical weapon in that scenario.
No, the potential scale is unknown and deeply concerning.
Okay, so pulling this all together, the strikes, the strategies, the limitations, the constant gnawing risk of escalation, what does this mean for policymakers and for you listening to this, trying to make sense of it all?
Well, Rand really stresses NATO unity. Any cracks or public disagreements in the alliance could be seen as weakness by Russia, potentially encouraging them to push boundaries or escalate.
And the dilemma over aid. Give it slowly to manage escalation or faster to help Ukraine win sooner.
That's the incredibly difficult trade-off. Rand doesn't offer easy answers, but highlights the risks of both approaches. Prolonging the war has its own dangers, including ongoing escalation risks.
And maintaining communication.
Absolutely vital, Rand says. Even when things are tense, keeping lines open with Russia is crucial. You need those channels if you suddenly have to de-escalate, to stop a spiral before it gets out of control.
It underscores the incredibly fine line everyone is walking. And the Lowy source kind of brings it back to the nature of war itself, changing before our eyes.
Yeah, they call these drone attacks a harbinger of future war. A salutary lesson. A sobering one about how relatively cheap, numerous technologies like drones are making traditional, expensive military bases much more vulnerable.
Forcing everyone to rethink defense in a fundamental way.
We're seeing the future of conflict unfolding right now.
Absolutely. So considering this cycle of attack and counterattack, the strategic limits, this ever-present risk of escalation, accidental or deliberate, here's the thought for you to mull over. How can the world effectively back Ukraine's fight for survival while navigating this incredibly dangerous tightrope, trying to prevent the conflict from spilling over or escalating in ways nobody can predict or control?
That's the central challenge, isn't it? The core tension highlighted by everything we've discussed. Finding that balance. There are no easy answers.